Hello everyone. I may well have gone mad. I am indeed bringing you a video today talking about buttons, and I suppose this is a fitting video for Commonwealth Day. We're talking about a very influential piece of Canadian Forces uniform design and how it evolved, and it's become quite prevalent in military kit, both issue and private purchase across the world. It was actually adopted by Britain with the Soldier 95 uniform. It had been used on RAF aircrew clothing prior to that, or a very similar design. And we're going to have a look at these slotted buttons, which were a part of Canadian combat uniform, but actually predate it. And we're going to have a look at how these developed. That's the topic for the video today. We'll get into having a look at this in some detail now. So we're going to start with the progenitor of these buttons, which takes us back to the Second World War and the introduction of Canadian battle dress uniform. These are actually post-war trousers, but they serve the purpose of illustration here. If I bring one of the buttons up to the camera here in close-up, you can see that these are made of metal. They are painted khaki, or drab, rather. If I take the belt loop away there, and bring this up to the camera here so it'll focus, you can see in the centre section there that there is a metal bar. Now, the constructions of these are quite interesting. They are pressed steel. You can see there are two parts there. You can see the rim around the outside, and as part of that there's a metal pin which goes through the centre there, and the thread is wound around that. So you don't have stamped holes in the button, you've got a much more rounded section of metal which the thread is then wound around, which means that there's not as much point of wear, there's nothing sawing away. It's a nice smooth rounded surface which the thread runs over, so as the button moves it's not sawing away at the thread, and these are therefore less likely to pop off. Certainly British metal buttons, which are stamped from brass, you get very rough edges on the four holes in the centre which the thread runs around when they're sewn on, and they do saw through the thread quite readily, and that's the same with any stamped metal button. These alleviate that fact, so they're less likely to pop off. So, as I say, Canadian battle dress buttons, which were also used on, well, obviously post-war battle dress, but also used on the trousers of the Canadian bush uniform, these negate some of the issues you get with metal buttons in terms of wearing away at the thread. Move on now to talk about another stage in the development, and this is the Canadian modified 1950 pattern Parker, which we've talked about previously, relatively recently in fact. Looking at the buttons here, you can see we've had a move forward. These are plastic buttons. They work in a similar way in actually having obviously two slots moulded into the button there, and then you pass a loop of cloth around these and stitch them on using this loop of cloth. Now this has two advantages. One, again, you're less likely to tear these buttons off, even more so than we saw previously with the metal buttons with the pin down the centre. The idea of ripping this section of cloth off at each end where it's stitched on, very unlikely, so they are very durable from that point of view. And you can also get your finger in behind. Now this isn't something that's replicated on every type of clothing that uses this style of button. Sometimes the cloth loop is just sewn to one point rather than having this section here that you can get your finger underneath. But this does mean that if you're wearing gloves in particular, it becomes a lot easier using this method to manipulate the button through the buttonhole. So button fastenings are obviously they have advantages regarding touch and close, and obviously touch and close wasn't really a thing at this point in military clothing. It was still to make an appearance on the scene in the 1950s. So this does allow you to manipulate these with gloves, and that's a very good feature of the design. Now these aren't the same pattern of button as you'd see later on, but they are the progenitor of it. The smaller buttons on this Parker, however, we look at the rank tab, which is on the front here. There we go. I was thinking it had epaulets for a moment then. You still have these four-hole buttons, and these would be carried across to the early Canadian combat uniform. So on early Canadian combat uniform, the small buttons would be four-hole buttons like these, and the larger buttons would be something similar to this, but slightly different in terms of pattern. So we'll bring in an example of the combat shirt coat now, a later example, and I'll show you what that then evolved to later on. So this is a later example of the Canadian combat shirt coat, officially speaking. The shirt, it's a lightweight combat jacket basically, and we can see here on the pockets we have a later development of this large button on the same system of loops here, but a loop of cloth that you can get your finger behind the button there to assist in manipulating it and using it when you're wearing gloves. This is the sort of standard of design, the standard button that was introduced with the Canadian combat uniform when it was first introduced. and then would set the pattern. These are used on all sorts of British combat clothing later on as well, exactly the same design of button, basically functioning exactly the same way, although as I say, the loop of cloth isn't always stitched on in the same way. Sometimes it's just stitched in one place, so it forms a loop and then you've got both ends stitched down on one side, rather than having this ability to get your finger behind the button. But nevertheless, you still get that increased durability of having this loop of cloth holding the button in place rather than just thread stitching it on. Now, as already mentioned, initially the small buttons on the Canadian combat uniform were 4-hole buttons like we saw on the Parker previously. But then around the late 1960s and through into the 1970s, manufacture switched over to smaller examples of the buttons which fit on a loop of cloth like this. And you can see that here. Hopefully the camera will pick it up and focus there. And these essentially set the pattern for the kind of buttons we see on the Soldier 95 uniform in British service as well. And obviously they've continued to be used on Canadian combat uniform, and it's become very influential. You know, the larger and smaller buttons of this pattern are now used on all sorts of military clothing. All sorts of countries use these, and as I say, used on a lot of private purchase military clothing as well. So I'll try and fold this down a little bit more neatly again. So very influential in terms of design. I think the first iteration of this you see on British uniform is a slightly modified design used on flight clothing, life jackets in some instances, and then obviously with the Soldier 95 combat uniform, you see them used on the shirts, the combat smocks, and everything else used in that new set of uniform. And obviously that's been carried through DPM and then MTP combat clothing going forward. And as I say, very influential on the private purchase market and on some civilian items as well. So there we are. I say maybe a bit mad of me, but making a video talking specifically about buttons. But these are from their origins in the Second World War and then development on Canadian cold weather uniform, and then this 1960s and 70s Canadian combat uniform. It was quite an influential development, and hopefully it's been interesting looking at this, even though it is a video talking specifically about buttons. So there we are, a video about something quite specific, but hopefully it's nevertheless been of interest. As I say, a very influential bit of design, very innovative and very effective for what these were designed for. And as I say, that was recognised, and this particular design of button has gone on to be used on all sorts of military issue clothing, private purchase items, and of course civilian items as well. It influenced civilian design to a degree as well. If you have found this interesting and you'd like to see more of this sort of thing, please do consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. And whether you're newly subscribing or you've previously subscribed, please do make sure you hit the little bell, the little notification button down below, and that will of course alert you when I upload future videos. If you really like my uploads and you would like to support the channel, you can. Both Patreon and PayPal are linked down below. And as ever, a massive thank you to everybody who supports the channel using those two methods. It's greatly appreciated, as I always say. Thank you all very much indeed. If you'd like to follow the channel on social media, you can. Facebook, Instagram and Twitter are all linked down below. And if you'd like to get in touch but you don't really use social media, there is of course an email address down there as well. That's everything for this video, so until next time, bye for now.